Welcome back, and now for the news in detail. The EU has rebuked Washington's attempt to legitimize the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, saying all the settlements in Palestinian territory are illegal. In a statement, EU Foreign Policy Chief Federica Mogherini said the settlements erode the prospect of lasting peace. Mogherini urged Israel to end all settlement activity in line with its obligations as an occupying power. Earlier, the US backed Israel over Jewish settlements in the occupied West Bank, reversing its 40-year-old policy. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo argued the buildings are consistent with international law.
The Trump administration is reversing the Obama administration's approach towards Israeli settlements. U.S. public statements on settlement activities in the West Bank have been inconsistent over decades.
The move was immediately slammed by the Palestinians and the rights groups. A spokesman for Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas said the U.S. move contradicts international law. Moving on, Israel claims it has intercepted 4 rockets fired from neighboring Syria. Meanwhile, Syria state media reported explosions were heard near the airport in Damascus. In a statement, Israel's military said the launches were located in Syria and intercepted by Israeli air defense systems. The army said no hits on Israeli communities have been reported. Minutes earlier, siren warnings of incoming rocket fires sounded in Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. The United States says it will impose sanctions on Egypt if it goes ahead with the purchase of Russian warplanes. U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs R. Clark Cooper said the deal risks Egypt's future military acquisitions. Cooper said using the Russian Su-35 could pose a threat to Egypt's ability to operate jointly with the U.S. and other NATO countries. Earlier this year, Egypt signed a $2 billion agreement with Russia to buy over 20 Su-35 fighter jets. Washington can impose sanctions under its Sanctions Act that targets the purchase of military equipment from Russia. The U.S. says it will end a sanctions waiver for Iran's Fordo nuclear facility next month. Last week, Tehran announced it has resumed a uranium enrichment at the site, pointing to non-compliance with the signatories of the 2015 nuclear deal. Speaking at a press briefing, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said there is no legitimate reason for Iran to resume enrichment at Fordo. He said Iran should not be allowed to enrich uranium at any level, and it must immediately reverse its activity at the facility. U.S. lawmakers are pushing the government to support regulations making it harder to sell sophisticated technology to China's military. Top Senate Democrat Chuck Schumer and Republican Senator Tom Cotton have written to Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross. In their letter, they pressed Ross to act speedily to ensure Washington isn't helping strengthen China's armed forces. Schumer and Cotton say China is aiming to acquire American technology with dual military and civilian use. NATO foreign ministers are meeting in Brussels this week ahead of a wider NATO meeting in London. Let's go live to Brussels with NATO Chief Stoltenberg is holding a press conference.
Telecommunications, including 5G. And our first counter-hybrid support team is in Montenegro this week. We will also discuss other strategic issues, including Russia, the implications of the rise of China, the future of arms control and energy security. NATO is the only forum that brings nations from Europe and North America together to address strategic security challenges. NATO remains the only guarantor of European and transatlantic security. And it is the responsibility of each of us to maintain and strengthen our unity in order to ensure credible deterrence and defense for all of us. And with that, I'm ready to take your questions.
Okay, we'll start with Reuters. Yeah. There.
Thank you, Secretary General. Two questions, if I may. On defence spending, we've heard this $100 billion figure for a while now. Can you give us an update on where you think, what sort of numbers you'll be presenting to President Trump? And secondly, on space as a domain, how can you avoid giving the impression that NATO in some way is trying to take ownership of space? Thank you.
We will publish new updated figures on defense spending before the leaders meeting in London in the beginning of December. And these new updated figures will be based on the national plans that all allies have provided. They have provided updated national plans before the meeting, and of course also on the budgets which have been agreed in different parliaments. So I will not pre-announce what we will publish then, but we will have updated and new figures for you in a few days before the NATO leaders meeting in London. What I can say is that it is unprecedented, the increase we have seen over the last years. And allies continue to increase, and after years of cutting defense spending, all allies have started to increase, and I expect that also continue in the years to come. On space, well, space is of great importance for our civilian societies and for any military operation. It's about communications, it's about navigation, it's about data imagery. Space is essential for almost everything we do. And therefore, to make sure that we have the right capabilities, that our missions and operations have the support they need, is of course important, and to coordinate also efforts among NATO allies is important for the alliance, and also shows that NATO is responding and adapting to evolving security challenges.
Okay, we have Wall Street Journal here, also on the second row.
James Marston from the Wall Street Journal. Secretary General, you've probably got used to dealing with the US President bashing NATO. Now we also have the French President bashing NATO. What's your reading of what President Macron said in this Economist interview? Have you reached out to Paris at all? Do you intend to try and find out more details, clarifications? And do you expect what he said to become part of the discussions in London? Thank you.
I'm planning to go to Paris next week to meet with President Macron, and my message is that NATO is adapting, NATO is agile, NATO is responding. The reality is that Europe and North America, we are doing more together than we have done for decades.
NATO foreign ministers are meeting in Brussels this week ahead of a wider NATO meeting in London. And at the moment, NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg is holding a press conference. Live visuals we are having on your TV screens from Brussels. Now moving on, Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam has said about 100 protesters are still inside Hong Kong Polytechnic University. The standoff has entered a third day.
The chief executive was speaking after China's State Council appointed Tang Ping-keung as the new police chief of Hong Kong. Lam said she had told police to try and resolve the situation peacefully.
The two important principles that I have laid out for the police operation. The first is, of course, to have a peaceful resolution as far as possible. This objective could only be achieved with the full cooperation of the protesters.
Meanwhile, China has rejected the Hong Kong High Court ruling against the ban on banning face masks.
The United States says South Korea should share more of the cost for hosting a U.S. military. Defense Secretary Mark Esper's statement came after Seoul broke off the talks earlier in the day following a public backlash. However, Esper added the U.S. State Department is holding more negotiations. Today's was held to renew the special measures agreement, which expires next month. South Korea's foreign ministry said Washington's demand for a drastic increase in defense costs is not acceptable. Seoul said it is willing to pay its fair share to strengthen the South Korea-US alliance. The current SMA agreement stands at $870 million a year. Under the SMA, Seoul has shared the cost of almost 30,000 troops stationed in the country since 1991. In another diplomatic embarrassment over Kashmir, an Indian representative was thrown out of Asia-Pacific Summit in Cambodia. BJP leader Vijay Jolly was ostracized after he tried to block Pakistan's National Assembly Deputy Speaker Qasim Soodi's speech on Kashmir. In his speech, Soodi told attendees about Indian brutalities in the valley for the last 107 days. As Soodi was sharing the details of Indian atrocities, Jolly started hue and cry, calling it internal issue of New Delhi. The security at the summit picked him up and took him out of the hall for disrupting the proceedings. Earlier, the US Congress and the EU Parliament highlighted the human rights crisis in the valley created by India since August the 5th. Former Pakistani Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif has left the country to seek medical treatment in the United Kingdom. He left after Lahore High Court allowed him to travel abroad for 2 months for treatment in London. The former Prime Minister left on Qatar Airways air ambulance along with his personal doctor and staff. Nawaz Sharif was disqualified by the Supreme Court in April 2017 and sent to jail on corruption charges. For the last 1 month, he was under intensive care after the level of his platelets in his blood kept on fluctuating. More stories to follow, but right after a short break. Welcome back. Turkish prosecutors have issued detention warrants for 133 military officers. State media says the warrants were issued over suspected links to US-based cleric Fethullah Gulen, blamed for a failed coup in 2016. It said the military officers include 3 colonels, 5 majors and 5 lieutenants. The probe was launched to arrest Gulen-linked suspects within the Turkish armed forces in Izmir. Prosecutors say the warrants were issued for 82 serving military officials. Turkey claims Gulen's movement orchestrated the coup attempt 3 years ago. Ankara also accuses them of being behind a long-running campaign to overthrow the government by infiltrating state institutions. Ukraine has threatened Russia with an $11 billion penalty if it obstructs the extension of transit gas pipeline agreement. The warning comes as the 10-year contract for the transit of Russian gas through Ukraine, Nord Stream 2, is set to expire next month. A Russian gas exporter Gazprom proposed an extension of the current deal or a new one-year agreement. Kiev objects to 1-year extension and is pushing for another 10-year commitment. The executive director of Ukraine's national oil and gas company, Naftogaz, Yuri Vitrenko, said the case will be taken up at an arbitration court. Russia also suggested resuming gas supplies to Ukraine that it cut off in 2015 at a price reduction of 25%. The Ukrainian Energy and Environment Minister Alexei Orzhal said Kiev rejects the proposals as inadmissible. Afghanistan's chief executive Abdullah has accused the government of killing an election observer and wounding 2 others. He said the government used force on people protesting in Kunduz against the resumption of a vote recount. Earlier, the Afghan Election Commission claimed issues with candidates have resolved and the recount has resumed across the country. Abdullah's party has demanded an impartial probe over the clashes. Former President Hamid Karzai said reports of forces opening fire on protesters are a matter of grave concern. Meanwhile, security officials and the Provincial Office of the Afghan Election Commission rejected the allegations. 15 people have been killed and 9 others injured in a coal mine explosion in China's northern Shanxi province. Officials say blast trapped 35 miners inside the mine in Pingayo County. State media says 11 miners managed to escape the pit. It said the injured are in a stable condition and an investigation to find the cause of the explosion is underway. It said poor safety measures led to the fatal incident. In Mali, 24 soldiers and 17 militants have been killed during clashes in the northeastern town of Tabankot. Mali's military says a convoy was attacked during an ongoing joint operation with forces from Niger. It said 29 people were injured in the raid, while 100 suspects were detained. Mali's army has now lost 100 soldiers in 2 militant attacks in this month. The border regions of Mali, Niger and Burkina Faso have been repeated have seen repeated clashes with militant groups. Mali has struggled to contain the militant insurgency despite help from African neighbors, the UN and France. In Australia, Sydney has been shrouded in a dangerous haze as scores of bushfires rage across the region. Strong overnight winds brought smoke from fire inland, pushing the air quality to beyond hazardous levels. Parts of the city recorded pollution levels 8 times higher than the national benchmark. Locals described hazy skies and the stench of smoke in their homes. More than 110 fires are currently burning across Australia's east, with dozens of blazes still uncontained. 6 people have been killed and hundreds of homes destroyed in bushfires across New South Wales and Queensland since September. Health officials are advising people to stay indoors and avoid strenuous activity.
All we can do is encourage people to be vigilant, to take whatever precautions they can, avoid the exposure. Don't exercise, which puts extra pressure on your lungs on a day like today when they're already under strain.
A UN report says over 7 million children are being held in prisons or in police custody around the world, but the United States has the highest rate of children in detention in violation of international law. Find the details in this report.
As the migrant crisis at the US-Mexico border surges, it seems the US is failing to protect the migrant children in its care. UN researchers say more children were detained away from their parents in the United States this year than in any other country on earth.
In terms of overall, and now I'm talking about children with their parents or unaccompanied children or minors, the United States is one of the countries with the highest numbers. We have still more than 100,000 children in migration-related detention in the United States of America. So that's far more than all the other countries where we have reliable figures.
The US detains an average of 60 out of every 100,000 children, who either end up in the American justice system or immigration-related custody. Meanwhile, at least 30,000 children, mainly linked to ISIS, are held in northern Syria and in Iraq.
Armed conflict, I think the main recommendation is treat those children, even if they were recruited as child soldiers and have committed crimes, treat them primarily as victims and not as perpetrators, and try to find ways for rehabilitation and reintegration into society.
The United Nations study called the detentions illegal and inhumane, and it says the children should only be held as a measure of a last resort and for the shortest time possible.
In Indonesia, a workshop is turning industrial waste and chicken feathers into rooster decorations. Its aim is to reduce waste and generate income for the local community. Let's see their creative work.
As cockerels crow in the background, workers craft life-sized figures of chickens from factory waste such as foam and scraps of fabric. They later cover the figurines with feathers taken from chicken slaughterhouses. 35-year-old Tarjaya, who like many Indonesians only uses one name, employs 6 to 10 people from the community at his workshop.
When I saw the waste, I felt that it was a pity. The material can be used to create artwork, for example, and so we can benefit and use it too.
The rooster decorations are sold widely outside the town and even abroad through social media. The workshop produces 60 to 200 rooster figurines in a month, selling each for approximately $18.
The figurine is nice and looks so real. Secondly, this is purely made from waste material. I appreciate Tarjaya because he is helping people to earn more income.
In a country that produces 175,000 tons of garbage a day, local environmentalists hope this initiative can help reduce and reuse waste.
Now the business updates. The U.S. Treasury Department says Russian holdings of the U.S. debt increased from $8.5 billion to 10 in September. In a statement, the department said long-term Treasury securities were around $3 billion, while short-term nearly $7 billion. Russia, once a significant holder of the U.S. state debt, started its sell-off of the U.S. Treasury securities in spring 2018. Last year, in April, Russian holdings were nearly halved from some $96 billion to nearly $49 billion. Japan remains the biggest holder of the U.S. state debt with over $1 trillion, followed by China. And now the weather situation from around the globe. And that's all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at Indus.news.